You're not the woman we were expecting." The sentence landed in the room like a glass shattering across polished marble. Every conversation stopped. Every eye turned. And for a moment, the skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed to disappear behind the tension gathering inside the executive boardroom on the 72nd floor of Whitmore Tower in Manhattan. Naomi Grant stood quietly near the entrance, one hand resting on a slim leather portfolio, her expression unreadable. She wore a tailored black suit, simple earrings, and low heels. No designer logos. No entourage. No dramatic entrance. Just calm confidence. Richard Whitmore, the billionaire patriarch of the Whitmore family, leaned back in his chair and gave her a slow glance from head to toe before exchanging an amused look with his son. Preston Whitmore smirked openly. "I thought the CEO was coming," he said. "Maybe she's here to set up for the meeting." A few restrained laughs drifted around the massive conference table. Naomi didn't react. She simply walked forward and took a seat near the end of the table. The move only seemed to encourage them. Charlotte Whitmore crossed her arms and tilted her head. "Wait," she said with a small laugh. "Are you from the consulting team?" Richard chuckled. "Either way, someone should let the real decision-maker know we're ready." The room carried the quiet arrogance of old money. Dark walnut walls. Custom lighting. Original artwork worth millions. A view overlooking Midtown that made visitors feel small. It was exactly the kind of room built to remind people who supposedly mattered. Naomi placed her portfolio on the table and folded her hands. Across from her, executives from both companies reviewed documents worth nearly $900 million. Months of negotiations had led to this morning. One signature could finalize everything. One signature could change the future of both organizations. Yet nobody seemed interested in asking who Naomi really was. They had already decided. Richard cleared his throat. "Well," he said, "while we wait for your boss, perhaps you can tell us whether she understands the scale of what we're offering." Preston grinned. "Assuming she's authorized to take notes." More laughter followed. Naomi remained perfectly still. She had seen this before. Different city, different room, different faces. Same assumptions. The kind that arrived before introductions and lingered long after facts. Outside, the clouds drifted slowly over Manhattan. Inside, the temperature of the room kept changing. Not because Naomi spoke, because she didn't. Her silence unsettled people. It forced them to fill the space themselves. And every minute they talked, they revealed more than they intended. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Naomi Grant. Richard slid a thick folder across the table. "Make sure this gets to the person actually making decisions," he said. "We'd hate to waste the morning." For the first time, Naomi looked directly at him. Her eyes were calm, steady, almost sympathetic. And somehow that expression bothered him more than anger ever could. Because while the Whitmore family believed they controlled the room, they had no idea they were already walking toward the most expensive mistake of their lives. The room settled into a strange rhythm after the laughter faded. Richard Whitmore seemed satisfied with himself. Preston leaned back in his chair, scrolling through messages on his phone as if the outcome of the meeting had already been decided. Charlotte occasionally glanced toward Naomi, her expression carrying the casual confidence of someone who had spent her entire life surrounded by people who agreed with her. Around them, attorneys, analysts, and senior executives organized spreadsheets, projections, and acquisition summaries across the polished conference table. Nearly $900 million sat inside those documents. Yet the most important person in the room remained invisible to almost everyone present. Naomi watched quietly. The city stretched beneath the windows in every direction. Yellow taxis looked like tiny moving dots. The Hudson River reflected the morning sun. 20 years earlier, that view would have intimidated her. Not anymore. She had built companies during recessions, negotiated mergers that analysts claimed would never happen, sat across from governors, senators, and Fortune 500 executives. None of that required her to announce herself. Real power rarely did. Richard opened the first presentation. A large screen illuminated behind him. Charts appeared. Revenue forecasts. Expansion plans. Growth projections extending 10 years into the future. He spoke confidently, explaining why the Whitmore family deserved favorable terms after the acquisition closed. Every few minutes he referred to the buyer as if that person existed somewhere else. Somewhere above Naomi. Somewhere beyond the room. Once your leadership team reviews this, he said, they will understand why maintaining our current structure is non-negotiable. Naomi simply nodded. Preston jumped in. The reality is that companies at your level do not usually handle deals this size. We are trying to make this process easier for everyone. Several executives exchanged uncomfortable looks. Some seemed uncertain. Others appeared eager to avoid conflict. The air in the boardroom felt different now. Less relaxed. More charged. Naomi noticed small details. A legal advisor avoiding eye contact. An investment banker quietly reviewing names on the transaction packet. A junior attorney studying her face with growing confusion. The room was beginning to notice things the Whitmores had ignored. Daniel Ross sat halfway down the table with a stack of legal binders open in front of him. At first he focused on contract language. Then he looked at a signature page. Then he looked at Naomi. Then back to the signature page. His eyebrows narrowed. Something was not adding up. Naomi saw the realization beginning to form, but said nothing. She preferred facts to arrive on their own. Richard continued speaking. Character matters in business, he declared. We only partner with leaders who fit our culture. The sentence hung in the air longer than he intended. Charlotte smiled faintly. Preston nodded in agreement. Naomi folded her hands together. There it was again. The language people used when they wanted to exclude someone without saying exactly why. Outside the windows, clouds drifted slowly over Manhattan. Inside, every minute exposed another layer of the Whitmore family. They believed they were evaluating a potential partner. In reality, they were being evaluated themselves. And with each careless comment, each assumption, each dismissive glance, they moved one step closer to a decision that would cost them far more than they could imagine. The presentation should have been moving towards signatures by now, but something else had taken over the room. The numbers on the screen continued to change. Revenue charts appeared. Forecasts expanded across future quarters. Yet fewer people were paying attention to the deal itself. More people were watching Naomi Grant. Not because she was speaking, because she was not. Richard Whitmore noticed the shifting attention and immediately tried to reclaim control. He straightened his tie and continued talking. Success is not only about capital, he said. It is about understanding how certain environments operate. His eyes drifted toward Naomi for a fraction of a second. The message was subtle enough to deny and obvious enough to understand. Charlotte leaned forward. Some people think money automatically gives them access to every room, she added. That is not really how the world works. Preston smiled. Especially at this level. A few uncomfortable glances moved around the table. The comments were no longer hidden behind jokes. The assumptions were becoming more direct. Naomi remained composed. She looked at the acquisition packet in front of her and slowly turned a page. The sound seemed louder than it should have. Across the table, Daniel Ross felt his stomach tighten. He had reviewed hundreds of transactions during his career. He knew exactly what he was looking at. The principal signer listed throughout the agreement was Naomi Grant. Not an assistant. Not an advisor. Not a consultant. The buyer. The founder. The chief executive officer. The person whose approval determined whether $900 million moved or disappeared. He checked the documents again. Then a third time. The answer never changed. Meanwhile, Richard continued speaking with growing confidence. The leadership qualities necessary for acquisitions of this magnitude are rare, he said. Not everyone is equipped to make decisions involving hundreds of millions of dollars. Charlotte nodded. Experience matters. Preston added. And credibility. The room felt smaller now. The Manhattan skyline remained visible through the glass, but the atmosphere inside the boardroom had become dense and heavy. Several executives shifted in their seats. One investment advisor quietly closed his laptop. Another stopped taking notes entirely. Everyone could feel the tension, even if they could not yet explain it. Daniel finally leaned toward Preston and lowered his voice. You need to look at the signature pages. Preston barely glanced over. Later. Daniel tried again. No. Right now. Preston frowned. What is so important? Daniel slid the document slightly closer. Preston looked down for less than 2 seconds before dismissing it. That cannot be right. Daniel stared at him. It is. But Preston pushed the papers aside without another word. The arrogance that had protected him all morning was still stronger than the facts sitting directly in front of him. Naomi noticed the exchange. So did Richard. Is there a problem? Richard asked. Daniel hesitated. Every eye shifted toward him. The young attorney felt the weight of the room pressing against his shoulders. He looked at Naomi. She met his gaze calmly. No anger, no fear, no urgency, just certainty. The kind that comes from knowing the truth does not need help surviving. Daniel swallowed hard. Something irreversible was approaching. The Whitmore family still believed they were interviewing someone beneath them. They still believed they controlled the outcome. But the foundation beneath that belief was beginning to crack. And with every careless sentence spoken across the polished conference table, the cost of their mistake kept growing. Daniel Ross could feel his pulse in his ears. The conference room remained silent for several seconds after Richard Whitmore's question, and in a room full of executives, silence was often louder than an argument. Is there a problem? Richard repeated. Daniel looked down at the acquisition documents one more time. The answer was sitting there in black ink. It had been there all morning. Everyone had access to it. Nobody had bothered to look closely because they thought they already knew who mattered. Daniel slowly closed the binder. Actually, he said carefully, there might be. The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Several executives turned toward him. Preston Whitmore looked annoyed. Charlotte looked impatient. Richard looked offended by the interruption itself. Daniel cleared his throat. The principal signer on every major approval page is Naomi Grant. For a moment, nobody reacted. Then Preston laughed. We know her name. Daniel did not laugh. I do not think you understand. The young attorney reached for the document and slid it across the polished table. Grant Meridian Capital is not represented here by Naomi Grant. He paused. Grant Meridian Capital is Naomi Grant. The words landed softly, but their impact moved through the room like a sudden change in pressure before a storm. Charlotte frowned. Richard stared at the papers. Preston looked down and finally read what he should have read hours ago. Naomi remained perfectly still. She neither helped nor interrupted. She simply watched. Daniel continued. She is listed as founder, chief executive officer, majority shareholder, and sole authorized signatory for the transaction. Nobody spoke. Outside the glass walls, Manhattan continued moving as if nothing had happened. Yellow taxis crossed intersections. Ferries moved along the river. Sunlight reflected off neighboring skyscrapers. But inside the boardroom, the atmosphere had changed completely. Richard picked up the document and read it himself. His confidence faltered for the first time all morning. Charlotte leaned forward. That cannot be right. Daniel nodded slowly. It is right. Preston grabbed another packet and began flipping through pages. Every document confirmed the same thing. Every signature page carried Naomi's name. Every approval route led back to the woman they had spent the morning dismissing. Across the table, one of the investment advisors lowered his eyes. Another executive quietly removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. The room suddenly felt much smaller than before. Richard forced a smile. Well, he said, attempting to recover. If there has been a misunderstanding, we can certainly clear it up. Naomi finally looked at him. A misunderstanding? She asked softly. Nobody had heard her speak in several minutes. The sound of her voice drew immediate attention. Richard shifted in his chair. Of course. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Interesting. Daniel noticed something then. She was not angry. She was not nervous. She was not even surprised. She looked like someone watching a prediction come true. The realization unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. Charlotte tried to laugh. This is getting blown out of proportion. But nobody joined her. The laughter that had filled the room earlier was gone. In its place sat uncertainty, doubt, regret. Daniel looked around the conference table and understood exactly what was happening. The Whitmore family had spent hours trying to evaluate Naomi Grant. Now every person in the room was beginning to understand the truth. Naomi Grant had been evaluating them the entire time. The silence after Naomi's question seemed to stretch across the entire boardroom. A misunderstanding. Richard Whitmore had chosen those words carefully, hoping they could smooth over everything that had happened during the last hour. But the room knew better. The executives knew better. Daniel Ross certainly knew better. There was a difference between a misunderstanding and a pattern. What had unfolded that morning was not confusion. It was assumption. And assumptions had consequences. Richard cleared his throat and attempted another smile. Perhaps we got off on the wrong foot. Naomi looked at him for several seconds before responding. No, she said quietly. You knew exactly which foot you started on. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was gone. In its place sat an uncomfortable awareness. Charlotte shifted in her chair. Preston stared at the documents in front of him. Even the advisors seemed reluctant to speak. Naomi slowly reached for the acquisition packet. Her fingertips rested on the cover page. The simple gesture triggered a memory she had not thought about in years. Suddenly, she was 24 again. A young entrepreneur walking into an investment conference in Chicago with a business plan tucked under her arm. She remembered the receptionist asking if she was there to deliver catering. She remembered the security guard directing her toward a service entrance. She remembered spending an entire afternoon trying to convince people she belonged in a room where she had already paid to be. Later that evening, she sat alone in a small hotel room, staring at the city lights outside her window. She had promised herself something that night. She would never waste energy begging for recognition. She would build success so undeniable that the facts could speak for her. The memory faded. The boardroom returned. The Manhattan skyline shimmered beyond the glass. Naomi looked around the table. Do you know what is interesting? She asked. Nobody answered. Not one person here asked what I had accomplished. Her voice remained calm. You looked at me and immediately decided who I could not be. Richard lowered his eyes. Charlotte opened her mouth, then closed it again. Preston seemed unable to find words at all. Naomi continued. You assumed I worked for someone else. You assumed I was here to take notes. You assumed leadership had a certain look. Every sentence landed with precision. No shouting. No anger. Just truth. Daniel watched the Whitmore family carefully. For the first time all morning, they looked uncertain. Not because they feared losing the deal. Because they were beginning to see themselves through the eyes of everyone else in the room. Richard finally spoke. Naomi, if any comments were interpreted the wrong way, she raised a hand slightly. The sentence stopped immediately. That is the problem, she said. You still think interpretation is the issue. The room became still once more. Outside, a helicopter crossed the skyline. Far below, traffic moved through Manhattan as if this meeting were just another business transaction. But inside the boardroom, something had broken. The old balance of power was gone. The Whitmore family had spent years believing money insulated them from accountability. Yet now they sat facing the one person whose signature could determine the future of their company. And for the first time that morning, they were beginning to understand exactly how much they had miscalculated. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The boardroom seemed suspended between two realities. One was the version of events the Whitmore family wanted to believe, where an awkward misunderstanding could be smoothed over and business could continue as usual. The other was the reality sitting directly in front of them. Naomi Grant had listened to every assumption, every dismissal, every comment. And now she was deciding what to do with that information. Richard Whitmore adjusted his posture and attempted to regain control. We should focus on the transaction, he said. That is why everyone is here. Naomi looked at him calmly. I agree. The response seemed to encourage him. Then perhaps we can move forward. Naomi reached for her phone. The movement was small, but every person at the table noticed it. She pressed a button and placed the phone on speaker. The call connected almost immediately. Good morning, Naomi, a woman's voice answered. This is Maya Ellis. Several executives recognized the name instantly. Maya Ellis was not an assistant scheduling meetings. She was the chief strategic officer of Grant Meridian Capital and one of the most respected executives in corporate finance. Naomi spoke clearly. Maya, open the acquisition review file for Whitmore Group. A pause followed. Opened. Naomi glanced around the room. Please activate executive protocol review and suspend the signing window pending further evaluation. The atmosphere changed instantly. Richard's expression tightened. Preston sat upright. Charlotte looked from face to face, searching for reassurance she could no longer find. Maya's voice remained steady. Confirming executive protocol review. The signing window is now suspended. No final approvals may proceed until further authorization from your office. The words echoed through the room. Suspended. No. Final approvals. Daniel Ross watched the color drain from Preston's face. The realization was finally becoming unavoidable. This was not a symbolic gesture. Naomi was taking action. Real action. Richard forced a laugh that sounded thinner than he intended. Surely that is unnecessary. Naomi did not look at him. Is it? Nobody answered. Maya continued speaking through the phone. Would you like the Ethics and Leadership Assessment Committee notified? Naomi leaned back slightly. Yes. The response landed like another weight on the conference table. Several advisors exchanged worried glances. Ethics reviews were not routine. They were serious. They examined culture, leadership conduct, reputation risk, and executive behavior. Deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars had collapsed under far less scrutiny. Richard's confidence began slipping away. Naomi, he said carefully, I think we can resolve any concerns privately. She looked at him. The concerns were public. Silence followed. Charlotte lowered her eyes. Preston stared at the documents in front of him without turning a page. Daniel noticed that nobody from the Whitmore side was smiling anymore. Nobody was making jokes. Nobody was talking about credibility or leadership. Maya spoke again. The review process has been initiated. Documentation will be attached to the executive file. Naomi nodded once. Thank you, Maya. Keep the line open. Of course, Maya replied. The call remained connected. The room no longer belonged to the Whitmore family. That shift was impossible to ignore now. The balance of power had moved quietly, almost invisibly, yet everyone could feel it. Naomi had not raised her voice. She had not demanded respect. She had simply used the authority she already possessed. And as the executives sat beneath the Manhattan skyline, watching the transaction slip further from their grasp, they began to understand that the most dangerous person in a boardroom is often the one who never needs to announce who they are. The speakerphone remained silent after Maya's last confirmation, but her presence lingered over the boardroom like a reminder that every decision now carried consequences. Nobody reached for a contract. Nobody talked about projections. The $900 million transaction that had dominated months of negotiations suddenly felt secondary to the question sitting at the center of the room. Who exactly had the Whitmore family spent the morning judging? Richard Whitmore finally exhaled and folded his hands together. The confidence that once defined his posture had been replaced by caution. Naomi, he began. Perhaps we should reset this conversation. Naomi looked toward the skyline beyond the glass walls before turning back to him. A reset, she asked. Richard nodded. I think everyone would benefit from a fresh start. Several executives seemed eager for that possibility. A path forward. A way to salvage the deal. A chance to pretend the previous hour had not happened. But Naomi's expression did not change. The problem with a fresh start, she said quietly, is that it usually requires people to forget what they already revealed. The room fell silent once again. Daniel Ross lowered his eyes. Preston stared at the table. Charlotte appeared unable to meet Naomi's gaze. Richard searched for the right response, but found none. Naomi stood slowly from her chair. The movement was simple, yet every person in the room immediately focused on her. She was not physically imposing. She did not need to be. Authority settled around her naturally, the way sunlight fills a room without asking permission. She placed one hand lightly on the conference table. This morning, she said, I entered this building as the same person I was yesterday. The same person I was last month. The same person whose company spent months evaluating this acquisition. Nobody interrupted. Nothing about me changed. Her voice remained calm. The only thing that changed was what you learned. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Charlotte looked away. Preston rubbed his forehead. Naomi continued. You called me unqualified without reviewing my record. You assumed I worked for someone else without reading the documents in front of you. You questioned whether I belonged in this room before asking a single question about what I had built. Every sentence landed with quiet precision. The words were not emotional. They were factual, and facts were difficult to escape. Then Naomi delivered the sentence that seemed to stop time itself. You spent an entire morning trying to impress the person whose approval you needed. She paused, and you never realized she was already sitting at your table. Nobody moved. Even the air in the room felt still. Daniel could almost hear the weight of those words settling across the polished wood surface. Naomi looked directly at Richard. I am Naomi Grant. Her voice was steady. Founder and Chief Executive Officer of Grant Meridian Capital. Majority shareholder. Principal decision maker. The woman whose signature determines whether this acquisition happens. Richard lowered his head slightly. Preston closed his eyes. Charlotte sat frozen. Naomi's gaze moved across the room. You believed you were evaluating me. Another pause followed. In reality, I was evaluating you. No one challenged her. No one could, because at that moment, every executive in the boardroom understood the same truth. The most important reveal was not Naomi's title. It was the character the Whitmore family had exposed before they knew who she was. The boardroom remained frozen long after Naomi finished speaking. No one challenged her. No one questioned her title. The documents, the suspended signing process, and the presence of Maya Ellis on the line had removed every doubt. What remained was the reality of what the Whitmore family had revealed about themselves. Richard Whitmore slowly leaned forward. The confidence that had defined him throughout the morning was gone. "Naomi," he said carefully, "I think we can still move forward." The words sounded smaller than he intended. Naomi looked at him for a moment. "Can we?" Richard nodded. "People make mistakes." Naomi did not immediately respond. Instead, she glanced around the room. Every face reflected a different version of the same emotion. Regret, embarrassment, concern. Daniel Ross sat motionless. Several advisors avoided eye contact entirely. Charlotte appeared uncomfortable for the first time all morning. Preston stared at the acquisition packet as if reading it again might somehow change what had happened. Naomi folded her hands. "Mistakes happen," she said. "Character reveals happen too." The sentence landed heavily. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Maya's voice came through the speakerphone before he could. "Naomi, the Executive Review Committee is requesting your recommendation regarding the transaction." The room became still again. Everyone understood what that question meant. The future of the deal now rested entirely with Naomi. $900 million. Months of negotiations. Years of strategic planning. All balanced on a single decision. Richard sat forward. "Before you answer that," he said, "I hope you consider everything we have built." Naomi nodded slowly. "I have." She looked out at the skyline one final time. The afternoon sun reflected across the towers of Manhattan. Far below, people moved through the city without knowing that one corporate decision was about to reshape an entire company's future. Naomi turned back toward the table. "Grant Meridian Capital evaluates more than financial performance." Her voice remained calm. "We evaluate leadership, culture, judgment, integrity." Nobody interrupted. This morning provided valuable information in all four categories. Preston lowered his eyes. Charlotte shifted uncomfortably. Richard said nothing. Naomi pressed a button on the phone. "Maya, please document my recommendation." "Ready," Maya replied. Naomi took a breath. "Effective immediately, I am withdrawing Grant Meridian Capital from the acquisition process." The words struck the room with the force of certainty. No shouting, no drama, just a decision. Richard's face lost color. Charlotte looked stunned. Preston closed his eyes. Around the table, advisors exchanged shocked glances. Daniel Ross slowly leaned back in his chair. Part of him had expected this. Another part still struggled to believe it was actually happening. Maya's voice remained professional. Recommendation recorded. Acquisition process terminated pending board confirmation. Naomi nodded. "Thank you." Richard finally spoke. "You are walking away from a transformational opportunity." Naomi looked directly at him. No, her voice was steady. "I am walking away from a preventable risk." Silence followed. The distinction mattered. She was not canceling the transaction because her feelings were hurt. She was canceling it because the behavior she witnessed exposed deeper problems. Problems no spreadsheet could solve. Problems no valuation model could measure. Problems that would remain long after the signatures dried. The boardroom felt different now. Not powerful, not prestigious, just quiet. The kind of quiet that arrives when consequences finally catch up with assumptions. And as the reality settled over the Whitmore family, everyone in the room understood the same thing. The deal had not collapsed because Naomi lacked qualifications. It had collapsed because they failed the evaluation they never realized they were taking. No one spoke after Naomi's decision was recorded. The speakerphone remained connected, but even Maya Ellis seemed to understand that the moment no longer belonged to procedures or paperwork. It belonged to consequences. The afternoon light stretched across the conference table, casting long reflections over contracts that would never be signed. Richard Whitmore sat motionless. For the first time all day, he looked less like a billionaire executive and more like a man trying to understand how certainty had disappeared so quickly. Preston stared through the glass walls toward the Manhattan skyline. Charlotte remained silent, her earlier confidence completely gone. Around them, advisors and attorneys quietly gathered documents, avoiding eye contact with one another. The room felt different now, not because Naomi had changed it, because the truth had. Naomi closed the acquisition folder and stood. The simple motion drew every eye in the room. She looked around slowly, taking in the people, the city beyond the windows, and the boardroom that had begun the morning filled with assumptions. Daniel Ross watched carefully. He would remember this moment for the rest of his career, not because of the money involved, because of what it revealed. Naomi picked up her portfolio and turned toward the door. Richard finally found his voice. Naomi. She stopped, but did not turn around. Immediately. Yes. Richard hesitated. The pause seemed to last forever. I would like to apologize. The words sounded sincere. Naomi nodded slightly. I believe you. The answer surprised him. There was no bitterness in her voice. No satisfaction. No celebration. Just honesty. Richard looked down. Then why walk away? Naomi faced him fully. Because apologies address behavior after the fact. The room listened carefully. Leadership addresses behavior before it becomes a pattern. Nobody challenged her. Nobody could. She continued. A $900 million transaction requires trust. Not optimism. Not promises. Trust. Her gaze moved briefly around the room. Today I learned something important. And when someone shows you who they are, ignoring it is not wisdom. It is risk. The words settled heavily over the conference table. Daniel lowered his eyes. Several advisors exchanged quiet glances. Even those who had remained silent throughout the meeting seemed affected by what they had witnessed. Naomi took a step toward the door. Then she paused one final time. This deal did not end because I was offended. The room became perfectly still. It ended because your assumptions spoke louder than your judgment. No one responded. There was nothing left to say. Naomi walked toward the exit. The sound of her footsteps was soft against the polished floor. As the door opened, the noise of the city seemed to drift faintly into the room. Movement, energy, possibility, the future waiting outside. Before leaving, she looked back one last time. I did not raise my voice, she said. I raised the standard. Then she stepped into the hallway, and the door closed quietly behind her. The boardroom remained silent. The contract stayed unsigned. The skyline remained unchanged. But everyone inside understood that something far more valuable than money had been tested that day. Character. And in the end, that was the only evaluation that mattered.